Lesson number 16 of Ethics, Governance and Sustainability. So now lesson number 16, which deals with legal framework, conventions, treaties on environment and social aspects. There are numerous topics which we need to cover, but there's nothing to be afraid of. So because it's just these are just small topics which we need to remember, and we have a pattern for it. So let us look into it. So first, United Nations Conference on Human Environment, which is a very important one, and then UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, Brundtland Commission, UN Conference on Environment and Development, Kyoto Protocol, Bali Roadmap, United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, Rio +20, Millennium Development Goals, 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is very important, ILO, Environment Protection in India, and finally Ecomark. So now let us look into lesson number 16 in detail. So United Nations Conference on Human Environment. This is also known as Stockholm Conference, and this is the primary or the first kind of a environmental conference which has been conducted by the United Nations. So it's a major conference on international environmental issues, and one of the key issues which was addressed was the use of CFCs, that is chlorofluorocarbons. Now throughout all these topics, so the major thing is the climate change and the greenhouse effect. So these are the major aspects which have been concentrated by these organizations or by the conferences, right? So this basically is the main first conference which has laid framework for the future environmental cooperation. But the most important thing is this is the conference which has created the United Nations Environment Programme. So UNEP has been created by the United Nations Conference on Human Environment. So that is the reason why we will be dealing in the next one we will discuss is UNEP. So this is how you need to connect from one topic to the other in this particular chapter, so that it will give you an easy revision of all the topics at the same time. So UNEP, what is meant by UNEP? So it's basically an internal organization, or you can say an internal body of the United Nations, with the purpose of it is to promote sustainable development of the global environment. So this is in general terms named as the voice of environment within the United Nations system, and the mission of it is very interesting. So it is to provide leadership, encourage partnership in caring for the environment by inspiring, informing and enabling nations and peoples to improve their quality of life without compromising that of future generations. So that is what is sustainability. So that is how they have given significance to sustainable development. So this is about the United Nations Environment Programme, and then the major events or major elements which you see later on, that is the Bali Roadmap, or you can say, or any other like UNFCCC. These are all the outcomes of the United Nations Environment Programme only. So United Nations Environment Programme has come up with many major events, and few of it we'll be discussing in the subsequent slides. The Brundtland Commission. So what is the Brundtland Commission? The object of the Brundtland Commission is to address the deterioration of human environment and the natural resources and those consequences in terms of economic and social development is what is the purpose for which the Brundtland Commission has formed. So the Brundtland has been named after the chairman, and the report of the Brundtland Commission has been named as Our Common Future, which has been published in the year 1997, that deals with the sustainable development and what are the policies required for achieving such sustainable development have been discussed there. And this is the commission which has given the most popular definition of sustainable development, which is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So sustainable development, the major definition which we have seen even under the first topic under sustainable development, under lesson 13 also we have given the same definition which has been adopted from the Brundtland Commission, and this is the most popular definition available for sustainable development. So basically what you need to remember under Brundtland Commission is that it is a this commission has been constituted for the purpose of addressing increasing deterioration of the environment. So because of the activities of the humans and because of their over dependency on the natural resources, the resources have been depleted, because of which the human environment is deteriorated, and what level of consequences it has on the economic and social development. In order to discuss it, they have formed a group called Brundtland Commission, which has come up with the document Our Common Future. So here the level of environment, see previously also the environment activism was there, but only specified to a limited nation or limited territory. But later they realized that environment is a global concern. It is no more a national concern. That is when they have come up with these kind of conferences. Now the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. So UNCED is very important because it has come up with major outcomes. So what is this UNCED? UNFCCC. It is again a program under the United Nations Environment Program only. It's an event under United Nations Environment Program. It is also referred to as Earth Summit or Rio Summit. So a question can be simply Earth Summit or a Rio Summit or UNCED, that is United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. So for all these three, the answer is again the same. So Rio Summit, why? Because it has been held in Rio de Janeiro. And it is held in the year 1992. Why 1992? It has a significance. We will discuss in the subsequent slide. So the outcomes of UNCED is something which we need to discuss in detail. So what are the outcomes? Firstly, Agenda 21. So they have come up with a document called Agenda 21, which is a blueprint for sustainable development into the 21st century. So Agenda 21 is nothing but in the 21st century, what is expected, what is it that which is expected from the people from the 21st century, and what level of goals the company should have or the countries should have for 21st century. So under this Agenda 21, it talks about the social and economic dimensions and the which the agenda should be spread, conservation of resources, management of the existing natural resources, strengthening the role of the deprived, that is the deprived people like lower working class and all, and also the professionals, that is scientists and other professionals, and finally the means of implementation of it. So through technology do you implement it, or through science do you implement it? All of these are discussed under Agenda 21 documents. The most important thing is the 21st century. So 21 stands for 21st century. The second outcome is the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. So under this, there are 27 principles which they have adopted on the same day. They have adopted these 27 principles which would guide for future sustainable development around the world. So under which the few of the major principles are, firstly again, human rights, promoting and respecting the same, equitable development, inclusive growth, the CSR activities, and the state shall cooperate to strengthen capacity building for the existing organizations for the sake of sustainable development. Effective legislations, environmental legislation have to be enacted, and the states shall cooperate to eradicate poverty, because that is concerned as one major block for sustainable development. And then participation of women in environmental management and development. So even if women should be actively involved in environmental management and development. And finally, EIA, that is Environmental Impact Assessment, shall always be undertaken by the state. So these are the major principles which have been adopted by the Rio Declaration. Now, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, under that the third outcome is the Statement of Forest Principles. So this is again very simple. So Statement of Forest Principles is basically a statement which is not legally binding on the countries who have signed it. So this is basically to have a global awareness about the management or conservation and sustainable development of all types of forests, right? So this forest principles talks about less deforestation, having more plantation, and all that stuff is something which is discussed under this. The next outcome is the UNFCCC, that is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is again on climate change. So what is why is it that there is a climate change? So a brief about the climate change. So climate change is not about the seasonal change as to summer, winter, or rainy seasons. If there are seasons, they are not climate. So climate change is an effect of global warming. So global warming is an effect of greenhouse gas concentration. So because of emission of more greenhouse gases, there will be global warming, that is increase of temperature near the Earth's atmosphere, because of which there will be a climate change. So climate change is total change of climate of the country. So it's like change in the patterns of your seasons, change in the patterns of your heat or day and night, everything comes under climate change, right? So, and again, ozone depletion is one of the end effects of climate change. So where there is a climate change, it has a negative effect on ozone layer depletion, and hence United Nations has come up with a framework on climate change, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is an international treaty made at the United Nations Conference of Environment and Development, and the signatories of such UNFCCC are divided into three categories. One, Annexure 1 countries, which are industrialized countries; second, which are developed countries; and third, which are developing countries. So the Annexure 2 countries, such as developed countries, they pay for the cost of developing countries as per the United Nations FCCC. Now, as told earlier, environment is no more seen as a national concern. It is considered as a global concern. That is why even developed countries should take responsibilities of developing the developing countries. So the major object of this UNFCCC is to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentration at a level which would prevent danger to the climate change. Okay. And what is expected of this as per this UNFCCC is that the industrialized countries should agree to reduce their emissions or emissions below their previous level. So all the Annexure 1 countries to make sure that they will not have excess of their emissions, and at the same time, if they are unable to reduce it, they have to buy such emission credits, which is nothing but carbon offsetting, right? So if they are not able to control their emissions, then they have to buy it from someone, but they cannot exceed their limits. That is what is the restriction on industrialized countries. The developed countries, they have to provide financial resources for the developing countries to make sure they also come under the ambit of industrialized countries. And the developing countries, they do not have any restrictions per se in terms of carbon emissions or whatever, because for the sustainability or like for the survival of such countries, they have to depend on industry, and for industry they may have to pollute, and when they are polluting, it's okay. However, once they are sufficiently developed, they have to volunteer, or they may volunteer to make sure even the other developing countries are given a push. Okay? So this is about United Nations FCCC, which is very important, and whenever you're answering United Nations FCCC, this whatever is reflected in this slide has to be reflected in your answer. The next outcome is the Convention on Biological Diversity. As the name suggests, is a biological diversity, that is diversity of many plants, fauna, flora, animals, every species has to be identified. The purpose is to conserve biological diversity and sustainable use of its components, and finally to equitably share the benefits whichever have been earned from such genetic resources, because these are very like sacred species, very rare species which you are like actually preserving. So there are many biological diversity parks which have been developed. Even Hyderabad is one such hub where you have a biological biodiversity park which has been inaugurated by the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and it has been a initiative under the UNCED, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. The final outcome, which is the Montreal Protocol, the purpose of such protocol is to reduce the production and consumption of ozone depleting substances, which is again in terms of climate change. So the target of this Montreal Protocol is to recover the ozone layer by 2050. By 2050, they would like the ozone layer to be back in its original form. So this is about the Montreal Protocol, wherein the other point is it stated several control measures to phase out the production of ozone depleting substances. Now the Kyoto Protocol. So Kyoto Protocol, so UNFCCC is a convention, and under the convention they have a pact. So protocol is like a pact, it's like an agreement. So it's an international agreement which is linked to the UNFCCC. So like a similar obligation under UNFCCC has to be complied under Kyoto Protocol. So under the protocol, they have set targets for the industrialized countries, that is Annexure 1 countries, for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And it is binding all the signing countries to stabilize their GHG, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the convention basically encourages them, whereas the protocol mandates them to do so. So that is the difference between the Kyoto Protocol and UNFCCC. And UNFCCC, it just encourages them to limit their greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the Kyoto Protocol mandates them to ensure they are stabilizing their GHG emissions, right? So under the Kyoto Protocol, for the industrialized countries, we have already seen that several targets have been set. For developed countries, they have to reduce their GHG emissions below the level specified for them and each of the treaty. And there are three mechanisms which have been developed. Number one, the carbon market, that is the emissions trading. So if you are not limiting your usage, then purchase the limits from some other company. Next, joint implementation. So you can jointly implement it with any other company in any other. So in developed countries, let us say any other developed countries, 2 or more developed countries can jointly implement their obligations in a developing country. And then clean development mechanism. So clean development mechanism, we have discussed this under sustainability terminologies. So that's an initiative by the United Nations wherein the developed countries are expected to develop the developing countries through the clean development mechanism. So that is again an outcome. Kyoto Protocol. Now the Bali Roadmap. So what is the Bali Roadmap? So it is again, it's like a conference. It's basically a conference which has been held on climate change in Bali, in Indonesia, wherein the participant, all the nations which have participated, they have adopted the Bali Roadmap. So roadmap is nothing but a futuristic statement. So here it is again a 2-year process for finalizing a binding agreement on preventing climate change. So again, this 2 years has been expired, and this Bali Roadmap is currently of not a significant importance. So it consists of many forward-looking decisions to reach a secure climate future. The Rio Plus 20, United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, Rio Plus 20. So what is this Rio Plus 20? So you remember I told that I'll discuss on the significance of the year 1992. So this plus 20 is nothing but 20, it is held in 2012, wherein it has actually given a glimpse as to what has been achieved in this 20 years. So it's a document which talks about the achievement made by the United Nations, achievement or the performance of the United Nations Conference in this last 20 years, right? So it is referred to as Rio 20 because it is again held in Rio. It's like 20 years after the Rio de Janeiro. So it is it basically resulted in a document which contained the practical measures for implementing sustainable development, because based on the experiences, what has to be done in the future has also been given. So various guidelines on green economy have been adopted. So the outcome document of Rio Plus 20 is named as The Future We Want. It is a 20-year follow-up of the United Nations Conference on Environment Development, which I have told you earlier. And the commitments which have been adopted under the outcome document are eradication of poverty, food security, sustainable agriculture, sustainable transport, sustainable modern energy, health and population. Like, you need to make sure all the populations are having adequate health and safety measures, and productive employment. So the Millennium Development Goals, the United Nations has come up with 8 international development goals which they have strived to achieve it by 2015. So again, this is not of a significance because they have already been expected, but again it might be tested. So one is eradicating poverty, universal primary education, gender equality, reducing of child mortality rates, that is death of a child even within 1 year after the birth, improving of maternal health of mothers and children, combating life hazardous diseases, environmental sustainability, and finally global partnership for development. So these are the 8 development goals which have been adopted, and as they have wanted it to be implemented by 2000 or achieved by 2015. But since it has not been achieved, and United Nations has come up with 30 goals, come up with 17 goals which has to be achieved by 2030. So another 15 years have been added. So which are termed as Sustainability Development Goals 2030. So 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So it's basically again same. It's like a plan of action for your people, planet, and prosperity. It is again built on the previous slide, that is the Millennium Development Goals. So since the Millennium Development Goals have not been, they have not been able to achieve by the 2015. So in order to achieve or to complete what has not been achieved by the Millennium Development Goals, they have come up with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this agenda basically sets forth 17 sustainable development goals which are spread across various things. Whatever you have seen earlier: eradication of poverty, education, primary health, maternity health, child mortality rate, everything is covered under this 17 sustainable development goals, and they have set 169 targets to balance the social, economic, and environment dimensions of sustainable development. Okay, so this is a document which talks about 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now, the International Forest Carbon Initiative, now as the name suggests, is again to reduce the emission from deforestation, because the more deforestation you do, the more level of carbon is being released. And it's an initiative again supporting UNFCCC. It is aimed at reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. It can be a part of equitable and effective international agreement on climate change. Next, the ILO, International Labour Organization. So it is established in 1919. So as the name suggests, it is basically aimed at social justice to prevent exploitation of workers in industrial countries. Right, because in industrial countries the work is done majorly by the labor than automation. More of the labor are involved, and hence their rights have to be protected. So labor rights, we have seen even under United Nations Global Compact, we have 4 principles dedicated for labor rights. So that is how significant is labor. So ILO, what does it do? Firstly, it regulates the working hours of the labor. It provides for adequate living wages. Health and safety is something which is stipulated. Equal remuneration, equal work is what is one of the aims of it. Freedom of association has to be provided. Child labor has to be abolished, and good and adequate working conditions has to be provided for the human beings. Right. So these are the 7 aims which has been adopted by the ILO. So which are fair and easy to remember as well. And one thing you need to recollect and write in your exams is that this ILO is a tripartite agency. So basically, in the International Labour Organization is an agency of United Nations, which is a tripartite agency wherein the representatives of the government, number one, representatives of the employees, number two, sorry, employers, it's not employees, employers, number two, and representative of labour workers, number three. All of these three form together in a tripartite United Nations agency, and that is termed as International Labour Organization, and they jointly formulate policies and programs which will be circulated to the member countries, and the member countries adopt it through their legislations. So this is about International Labour Organization. So under environment protection in India, so based on all these conferences and conventions and commissions, in India they have come up with environmental protection through various legislations. So what are all the legislations? So just remember the names of the legislations, and that itself is sufficient. So first is the Water Act 1974, Air Act 81, Environment Protection Act 1996, Public Liability Insurance Act, National Green Tribunal, Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, Wildlife Protection Act, Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act 2006. So the names of the act itself give you the object of the act, so there's no much thing you need to strive hard to remember all this. So as a measure of environmental protection, all these legislations have been enacted in India, which is an end result of the previous legislations or of all the previous laws which we have discussed. And also the Biological Diversity Act 2002. Finally, the concept of Ecomark. So what is an Ecomark? So it's like an earthen pot which will reflect as an earthen pot. So the government of India had actually launched that mark. It's a labeling scheme which they have launched for identification of environment friendly products. So the term environment friendly is very important. So if a product is environment friendly, which is used in a way which reduces the harm caused towards the environment, it would be considered as an environment friendly product, and an Ecomark will be awarded to such consumer goods which meet the specified criteria and the requirements of the Indian standards. And in case you find any product with the mark, with the Ecomark, that is the earthen pot, it will be treated, it can regard it as an environment friendly product. So this is the concept of Ecomark. So with this we have finished this chapter on legal treaties, conventions and all. So before I conclude, I'd just like to give one examination tip for the students. So see, usually we have a fear of too many regulations, too many conferences and too many principles. You'll be like, what if something is asked all of a sudden I am not in a position to recollect, right? So that is the reason why you need to always connect the topic or the subject with the name of the heading, right? So that will help you ensure recollect the particular topic. So not just read as if you are like just trying to remember something. It doesn't happen, right? So have a relation between the topic and the name given to that particular, to the particular thing. So say each commission, each conference has its own significance, correct? So as far as this PPT is concerned, if you take note of all these points, that itself is a sufficient answer you can make out in your exams, and the discussion I make is something which should be there in your mind. Okay, so with this I finish this topic. So lesson number 17, which will be released shortly in the evening, today in the evening. Okay, thank you.